Tim is sideways. Okay, but that's okay, because this is what we do on this show, is change perspectives, right, guys? I promised you I would do that. Welcome back, everyone, to another gathering of the Fractional Forum. And now Tim is super zoomed in. Tim is so mad at his devices right now, you guys, just so you know. So if he seems maybe a little distracted, let's give him a break.
He's the one doing it on an iPad. It's self-inflicted.
Yeah.
I even changed devices, so now I got 2 devices that are making me angry. So
Restream just wants you to be the guy who's sideways, Tim.
I guess so.
We don't know why.
That feels like a workaround, Tim. 2 screens instead of fixing the actual problem. Just saying.
Ooh.
We've decided.
Can we talk about fixing the actual problem on the Fractional Forum? That sounds like something we do here. Okay, so rewind. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the gathering of the Fractional Forum. And if you are joining us, you are not just I don't even know what I want to say. You know what you like when a participant just sits there and they like don't participate. But the only word I can think of is participate, and then it's just like a whole bunch of using the word participate. You're not just there to consume this content. You are here to participate. Engage. Get engaged. Hey, you guys, it's the holiday episode of the Fractional Forum, so it's going to be what it is for today. But anyway, if you are here, please participate. Get into the comments. We would love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, your experiences as we walk through one of the business problems that has been submitted to the Fractional Forum. And I'm actually really excited about this because while we mostly have focused on for-profit businesses to date, we actually have a nonprofit problem that we're going to be talking about today. And I feel like as part of the holiday season, this is a really great opportunity for the Fractional Forum to give back to a local nonprofit. So we're super excited to participate in the conversation today. And so again, if you are here and you would like to contribute to our nonprofit mystery guest for today, we would love for you to do that. So please feel free to get into the chat. With that, panel, are you ready for the problem of the day? You know, that just reminded me of like the 3rd grade where we actually had a problem of the day. It was for like a word math problem, but maybe this is just a maybe trickier version. And Islam is joining us again. Thanks for joining us again, Islam. Now, repeat guest on the Fractional Forum. So please feel free to share your insights with us as well. Okay, so the business challenge that this organization would like the Fractional Forum to tackle is how to create meaningful partnerships that are not in the business of competition that will result in meaningful collaboration that can result to financial rewards such as funding. So goals at the end of the day is, which I think is for a lot of nonprofits, more funding, right? More donations, those types of things. What impact is that challenge currently having on your business/personal well-being? I think the impacts that I'm having as a social entrepreneur is sustainability towards the business and addressing systemic barriers as a minority leader that faces racism and competition on a daily basis. Also, how do I create sense of belonging and authenticity towards the community? Well, for those of you who know me, know that those are some of my favorite words. They have taken some previous steps to address that, specifically from a single leader perspective. So the leader has done some work in removing egotistical thoughts and focusing on the social impact. They're not sure how those are working out, but they continue to invest in that. And in anything else they would like to share, it's really just questions. And I think these are more philosophical questions, so we'll see where we go with them. Why do grassroots organizations continue to be under-supported and underserved while the demand for them continues to increase? So interesting philosophical part of the puzzle for today. So I mean, we talked about kind of systemic barriers. We talked about meaningful partnerships, meaningful collaboration to move to funding. Does anybody want to take that and run with it in a direction?
I think, without knowing too much more about it, one of the first things that pops into my head whenever I think about, some of these challenges that they're mentioning is really about clarity. And I think that, everything from funding to being able to rally people around a cause, I think comes down to a sense of clarity and purpose around, what that message is and what the vision of that not-for-profit could be. And I
Weird.
think
We're talking about clarity on the Fractional
I feel
Forum.
like
That's weird, hey guys.
a clarity buzz, maybe like a swear jar. I'm not sure if we're allowed to say clarity anymore, but I think that
We could collect all the money in that jar and donate it to charity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I think sometimes there's a tendency to maybe take on too much, especially with social-minded folks, and say, hey, you know what, I do want to change the world, and I do want to change the community and the places where I'm working, where it's an easy trap to say, okay, I'm going to focus on this, and this, and then all of a sudden that message gets a little bit cloudier. And the ability to be crystal clear on what you're doing, why you're doing it, and who you're doing it for, I think could really impact a lot of those initial components that this person that submitted the issue was referring to.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think one thing I was just going to say, one thing that jumped out to me, which is kind of building off a bit what you said, Keith, as I draw my little map of like things that pop in my head, meaningful partnerships came up. One thing that I notice a variance in is, and this is a statement that's widely used, but switching out one word is really important. So working towards a shared objective. That's typically where meaningful partnerships start. The other kind of word that often gets like switched out is shared switches to common, right? So common you can do by like, we're here at the same time every day. We all get paid. But I think with this one, like the sense of belonging, and then shared to me ties into belonging, which I know Tracy can go really, really deep into. But actually doing that deep work as a partnerships. Now, I'm assuming that this partnership is a mix of internal and external, likely with a social enterprise. There's likely a combination of both with, volunteers and then, like the actual consistent individuals in the enterprise. But I wonder if there is even that shift of working together towards a shared objective versus common. And as we've talked about, that starts, like the clarity and so it's alignment. But with a social enterprise, this is where belonging is a little bit more important than alignment. Not that alignment isn't important, but I think that's easier to achieve in corporate. Just throwing that out there. That was something that popped in my head, is just even that play on language between shared versus common.
I think that's a really important differentiation, Lindsay, but also a really important call out to how sometimes our language muddles our understanding of what we're trying to do. It's really interesting, and this is like a separate thing, but after I had my son, I went through this postpartum like fitness training program, and so much of the coaching was around what is common versus what is normal. Because just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal. And like these types of things, we tend to interchange words like that very readily, and we forget that they're not the same thing. So I think you make a really important point with this concept of shared, and especially in a social enterprise, the concept of what we are sharing ties into that belonging very much so, in that if you have volunteer board, if you have volunteers who are doing work for the organization, you have paid people who are doing work for the organization, you have funders, you have donors, you have community partners, the sharing of that is very important. And then for me, from a marketing perspective, this turns into the narrative, right? The narrative is an opportunity for us to share what we're all about here, to create the opportunity for that alignment to exist. And I would also say in a lot of small social enterprises, because there's not particularly funds available for marketing, a lot of the potential in the story, which is actually free, right? The creating of that story, working on the vision, sharing that vision, that activity, it takes time, but there's no cost associated with it. You can share it on social media for free. You can share it in the community for free. You can get on the news for free, right? Like there are lots of things that you can do for free, but if that clarity, as Keith kicked us off with, isn't there, then it's very difficult to harness those opportunities.
I just want to add something that clicked for me when we were talking about working within these partnerships and potentially competing for resources or maybe overstepping. And I do think that there's an opportunity to think of these partnerships just as you would in any organization around roles and responsibilities. People really need clarity around what they are responsible for. And, I think that there's an opportunity there to really highlight roles for each partnership. And also something actually I worked on with a couple of clients post-COVID, or maybe it was even during COVID. It was very difficult for a lot of nonprofits to get funding. And there were two organizations that tried to look at things differently, different perspective. Tim knows all about that. So what they did was they actually took a look at what they were very good at individually, so they didn't have to compete for resources anymore. And maybe there was a shared service that they could offer together. So there's lots of different ways that they can kind of reframe the way that they think about these partnerships to, one, create clarity around the roles and responsibilities that they each have, and they have a laser focused energy that's put towards those particular responsibilities. Or they could take a look at, what are we individually really good at and what can we drive towards to cut costs so that we're not doing the same things. Maybe we can, you take on the HR responsibility, we'll do the finance piece of it, whatever it may be.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
It totally echoes. I see Brooke had a comment in there around differentiation, how I think what they said was, how is this basically something that isn't already being done, and why are you the best position to do it? I think that totally aligns, that totally matches up with what you're saying, Barrett. It's figuring out what are you really, really good at doing. The reality with any kind of nonprofit is you're going to have finite resources, finite funds. So you really want to get good at how are we going to deploy those? And you're almost thinking about it as what is the cost of running your operation and what's the impact you're making? And I think there's really when you mentioned, Tracy, that storytelling element, I think there's a huge opportunity for a finance and marketing person to put their brains together and start looking at how can you tell that financial story around, look, you donate X dollars into this. Here's the impact you're able to make. I think if you look in Calgary, you look in Canada, people are actually quite generous if they're able to see how the contributions that they're making is translating into a really big impact. But you have to be pretty good at showing, you have to really be good at telling that story and showing how you're different and how you differentiate.
Yeah, and Carolyn, do you also want to touch on, because Brooke shared another comment about sustainability in terms of how some initial funding can provide the fuel to build a longer term funding model. So is there some framework you'd like to add there as well?
Totally, right? So, any company, nonprofit or not, a certain amount of your cost base is fixed and a certain amount of your cost base is variable. So the reality is you're going to need someone in a fixed capacity that's maybe the executive director. You're maybe going to need a website. You're going to need certain things, whether you're serving one client in the community or 100, right? And some of those really don't necessarily scale with the number of different people that you're serving, that your organization is impacting. But then really figuring out a way to like, what is your minimum viable, like what's your minimum viable level, right? Because how can you make those variable costs associated with, and again, we don't know in this nonprofit, exactly what it is that they're doing, but let's assume that let's pretend that they're giving, job skills and, different sort of things to maybe an underserved community, or maybe they're doing some things along those lines. There's a certain amount of those costs that are variable. So really being able to make that equation really pop to kind of say, look, it's the equivalent of, you say, like a $10 donation to the food bank feeds, however many different people. You're like, wow, $10 can be stretched really, really well. So spending a little bit of time to figure out, like, what's your fixed cost? What's your variable cost? And I think realistically, to Brooke's point, there is a certain level of sustainability that you need to build in, because if you were to put all of your resources and 100% of your attention just on serving your intended community, and that's amazing, how are you going to renew your next grant? How are you going to be able to communicate to donors? How are you going to be able to fundraise additional funds? So as much as you kind of have to play a little bit of a game of kind of looking at, you want to put 100% of your time to really like helping the people do like the whole core of what you're doing, you do need to spend a little bit of time and a little bit of effort thinking, how do we keep that engine running again and again and again and running really sustainably?
Well, and I think that brings up an interesting point as well, because I was out for a Christmas cocktail with someone yesterday, and they run a not-for-profit that actually supports not-for-profits from a technology standpoint. And one thing I didn't really fully realize, that I think was probably playing into some of the stress that this individual is feeling too, is that as much as they're a small business for all intents and purposes, they have these, when you start to go for grant funding, when you start to go for some of these external sources of funding, the compliance and regulatory reporting, the security reporting, all of these different external factors that you might be able to skirt by when you're just a 1 or 2 man shop, really still apply when you're this small entity. As much as technology, I think, can be the great equalizer in terms of their this organization's ability to scale, the ability to tell their narrative once they have that clarity. It also does, being a not-for-profit, open up some interesting doors around what they're doing, like data security, data privacy, compliance, technology security, etc., when they think about the community and the base that they're serving there as well. So I think that it's, when you think about that fixed cost base, there's some additional considerations that I'm sure are creating some stresses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Tim, I'd love to hear, because I think a lot of times people forget that like collecting funds is like sales. We are telling a story that will allow people to give us money to do things. So what are some of the things that you've seen from a like sales principle perspective or something like that can add value, or maybe framing to collecting funds from a nonprofit point of view?
We talked a lot about clarity, alignment. Carolyn was just talking about understanding the impact that you're making. And I think that at the end of the day, whatever organization you're in, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a private enterprise, you're serving someone. And does everybody in that organization understand what that situation is? And a lot of times we get inside an organization, you're 2-3 levels removed from that interaction with whoever you're impacting. You've got to spend some time out in the real world with the people that you're serving, and so that you understand that. And what I'm doing in this support capacity, how does that impact the person out there? So to answer the question that you have from a sales perspective, in a nonprofit, sometimes you have the people that are serving the people that you're trying to impact, and you have the people that are trying to raise money. They're not quite the same person like they are in some other organizations. So you got to make sure that you first understand the impact, so you can tell the story, just like Carolyn was saying, and then you can bring that emotion into it, and you can share the stories of what you've seen out there and bring that emotional response. Buying, donating, it's an emotional response. You want to tell a story, you want to evoke emotion and get them to want to help.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to jump to a comment that Islam shared over here. It's very long, so I can't show it all, but I will read it all. The first question that pops to my mind is, do they seek more belonging for more fundraising or to connect with the community for local projects? If they are seeking funding, they should collaborate with marketing and PR agencies to introduce them to companies seeking to do CSR, which will yield more fundraising. If they are seeking CSR, corporate social responsibility. If they are seeking to be part of the community, however, for local community projects, they should ask for assistance in collaboration with other local organizations, or their hires should be more locally based for that alignment with the community's values and ethos. Super robust comment there. If our submitter is watching, you can find the whole comment in the LinkedIn version of this live. Probably on mine because there's multiple of them, and I think Islam's coming with real mine. But this is a really great point because, again, similar to what you touched on at the beginning, Lindsay, is that we can say things like belonging, but then, like, where does that end? Like, are we looking to only facilitate belonging within the programs? Are we seeking belonging on the board? Are we seeking belonging in the community? Are we seeking belonging with donors? What does belonging... This is fun. So, like, my very good friend Paul Howery, he's like a belonging expert, and his definition of belonging is that we feel, own, and care for each other in our successes, or dreams, successes, and failures. And so it's really interesting to look at that from a nonprofit or social enterprise point of view, because, like, what does that look like? What does it look like for the executive director to care and feel and own, care for the board, and vice versa, and for the participants in the program? Because as you said, Tim, often the people who are funding aren't the actual recipients of the skills. And so how do we create that? I mean, to me, this is saying community, right? Like, there really needs to be this community around that central vision of who we're serving and why we're serving them. And I know, like, I don't want to take this fully marketing because I just get very excited about it from a marketing narrative point of view. But I also want to, Brooke had a very interesting question, which I think will add some value to our submitter. When funders are looking so strongly to get away from operational funding, where do we find sources to support those fixed costs in the long term? And I think this is a really good, really valuable question for any social enterprise, because this is true, right? Like, I just want to pay you to train the participants, right? Okay, but I'm the executive director, has to pay to live somewhere and eat and all of these things too, right? So it's interesting, and his additional note here, are we risking that nonprofits migrate to cost recovery models? I mean, I'm sure all of the thoughts are coming up for you, Carolyn. So do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, right? Like, the reality is that you're still, even though you're running a nonprofit, like, there really is that challenge of going to the cost recovery model. But like you said, like, the executive director, there is a certain component of cost associated with it. I think, Keith, you were also mentioning, like, there is putting in place a grant. If you're a really, really tiny not-for-profit, that's a really heavy lift. Even getting registered with the CRA as a registered charity, like, you need a certain level of operation. And the reality is that's extra challenging if you're grassroots. If we kind of think that, if we kind of deduce that grassroots tends to be smaller organizations, it is tough to remain viable when you have a certain kind of heavy amount of fixed costs that need to be put in place. I think, actually, if we go right back to where the submission kind of started and their question around, like, partnerships, I think that's the key. Like, I think you're actually on the right path of figuring out, like, who do we partner with? Because if you try to do it all on your own, yeah, you're going to be bearing a really big brunt of fixed cost, really a big brunt of fixed cost just on your own as an organization. So I think spending a little bit of time brainstorming, who do you think those partners might be, and starting to kind of bring them to the table, and then figuring out together, like, what's collectively a sustainable business business model for each of those. Because yeah, the reality is there is a certain amount of fixed cost that has to exist, but I think really exploring partnerships starts to open up all kinds of opportunities.
So
And
that's
partnerships start, I was just going to say, partnership starts with conversations, right? Like looking in this room right here, it starts with conversations. The six of us started a conversation. We all have, a shared hope of helping others, having, diverse discussions, learning from each other. And by willing to go into that with an open mind and open heart, things are likely going to, work out. I think the other thing too that I wanted to point out is like being focused. And this is like where like lean manufacturing and things kind of come in, although that's very much like large organization. But the idea there is you're getting the most out of what little you have. And this is complex. Like, like Tim mentioned, there's like it's a B2C and a B2B, right? Because you have the, the individuals that are part of the program that are benefiting, that, the impact is going to those individuals, or as a result of them attending. And then you have the donors, and then you also have like, so really you have two sides of that. So it's added complexity, which typically is added cost. So the one thing with partnerships is it's great, but you bring a lot of different, perspectives in a conversation, and often it's hard to be focused. But that's where, you got to really start and talk about like what got you here. Like all the individuals in the room landed in that situation because of, a pathway, something working out, not working out, whatever it was. And that's the power of storytelling, not just from like marketing. I mean, the best storytelling is, just telling your story, like in a way of, this is how I feel, this is how I show up, this is me today, like, let's work together. You're likely going to solicit like belonging by being super open. And one thing that popped up is the leader who submitted, if I understood it correctly, I was kind of writing notes, but there was the word ego that was in there. So that's amazing. So as we all know in these situations, that the leader needs to go first. So that is spectacular that leader was willing to do that. If there's other leaders in this conversation, or if there's other leaders that are coming in and out of partnerships, how can that leader really like nurture that out of others? Often egos come up when we have a scarcity mindset, or we feel threatened, or whatever. So the willingness to work through that and build towards that belonging, towards, to achieve the shared objective, is going to work for everyone. But the power of a not-for-profit is that there is so much passion behind what they're doing. So it's just making sure that with all this other like noise of, funding and clients and stuff like that, like why are they there? Go back to that. I often talk about having, aligning intention with action, because like if we look at their acting, maybe not so like deliberate, in a way of like action is just like, a year passes and you have like a million actions that have happened. But like go back to your intention, and what was it, and why are you here? And often, as we all know, like as entrepreneurs, when you're exhausted, when you're overwhelmed, when you didn't get the sale, when you feel like you're at odds with your partner or partners, going back to that is kind of like what keeps you going.
Yeah, we got a great comment here for Chris, reiterating that the intentional conversations create better impact to both parties. The greater the relationship, the greater the impact that will eventually create a great partnership. Keith, I think you had something on your mind.
Yeah, I'm actually super glad that Lindsay went first there, because I kind of want to tie the two together, because the driver, I think, for a lot of these folks that go and take those steps to start some sort of social enterprise, I think it actually maybe, I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts, hinder some of their long-term growth. When you start to think about creating those partnerships, I immediately went to the idea of how do you grow the impact of what you're doing. And I think what Carolyn mentioned at the beginning was We need to get some of those partnerships in place to actually scale the organization. And you're not going to be able to have the bandwidth to say, okay, we're going to hire 4 or 5 people right off the bat. We're going to grow this team. So you need to do it through an ecosystem perspective. And I wonder if all of the energy is being spent on those, we'll call them growth partnerships, to say, okay, well, how do we further the mission? How do we really double down on the work that we want to be doing versus the work of building some of those sustaining partnerships that actually help keep the organization afloat and give it that scale mechanism down the line. I'm curious on everyone's perspectives, but I hadn't even thought about it that way, and I thought it was a really interesting observation, Carolyn.
I'd like to jump in on partnership, because it can be such a broad perspective of things that it could be, right? It could be locally you're working together to have some scale because you're both trying to do the same thing, or it could be finding somebody like your organization in the opposite side of the continent and saying, we have the same challenges. How are you going to collect those funds? How are you making that impact out there? I connect with a lot of fractional CROs around North America, and I ask them the same questions because we're all facing the same challenges. Sometimes you worry about going after the same dollar locally. I think there's lots to go around. I think you can share, to Lindsay's point and to Chris's comment, you can be open and have authentic conversations and learn. And so those partnerships could be really small. It could just be, I have a conversation with this person once a month and we just share and learn from each other. Or it could be some of the things that Baird said at the start about how do we work together so that we're bringing some scale as 2 different organizations.
Yeah, and I would love to, on this part, because one of the things that comes up for me when we're talking about using our ecosystem to fill what would be the roles, hopefully future employed roles within the organization. It makes me think back to what Vered said about roles and responsibilities, but also this concept of a skills matrix, which I think is very common in nonprofit board recruitment. And so if you are a social enterprise, a nonprofit, especially if you're a nonprofit and you're going to get certified as such, you need a board. You have to have one. And so there's an opportunity to recruit the right people for those roles instead of just recruiting people to fill seats. So Vered, I'd love to hear from a recruiting perspective, what can be done to help support that kind of ecosystem growth.
Yeah, I would question whether they have someone on the board that has expertise in fund development, right? If funding is a challenge for them, having someone come in with that level of knowledge and setting up funding diversification. A lot of the times when you're moving to a cost recovery model, it's because you have a lot of government funding and they have those requirements. So how do we diversify to outside funding that would be more market driven? Because the concern I would have there too, just to kind of go off topic a little bit, is what I've seen a lot in nonprofits is, they're looking at salary surveys, the Bolin survey. So that's the nonprofit salary scale. But the reality is you're competing across the market to find the best talent. And so you need to go beyond just the minimum of the Bolin survey to get the right talent in place. And that doesn't really drive well when you're looking at federal funding or provincial funding. They're looking at, okay, what's sort of the bottom line costing that you should have? Are you overrun with your costing? And so how do we build in diversification of funding? And to do that, you need someone that's an expert, hopefully on your board, to at least develop that framework for you. And then also, the other piece of it is around obviously having the skill sets around governance, building great strategy, taking it back to their value system, purpose, and building a long-term strategy that would support bringing in the right partnerships to fulfill their vision, their mission of their organization. And then also, of course, having some level of HR support as well, so that you're you are replenishing that board with the right skill sets.
I totally agree, right? Like that diversification of funding is so important. And I think as you were mentioning it, the recruitment challenge is definitely real, and kind of brought me back to what Lindsay was saying around kind of like that scarcity mindset a little bit. I just wanted to share my own experience. I'm a board member on a volunteer or a not-for-profit. And really what we were finding is like all of our board members had good skill sets, but we were tapped out in terms of like how many hours we could kind of contribute, because we're all working and we're all doing other sort of things. And I think it brought us to, like, with most of us working primarily for-profit companies, I think we missed a really obvious recruitment piece of volunteers. And so we finally ended up putting that in place, but it was just something that wasn't quite on our radar. And I think that's one of the unique things that as a not-for-profit, yes, it's easy to get sucked into like scarcity mindset and like there's not enough to go around, but there's also like there is actually huge opportunities there. So what we ended up doing was kind of said like, look, our board has like a very important skill set that needs to be like put those limited hours available to the most beneficial piece. And then we ended up finding like the volunteer opportunities were huge wins. We ended up, finding a lot of students that were desperately trying to get their foot in the door, desperately trying to get professional experience. We ended up finding a lot of people that were new to Canada that were just really being able to like really looking to kind of build their network, build some connections. And so it became this really like a perfect win-win. Not to say that there's not effort associated with coordinating and kind of like effectively managing volunteers. Like that is still a task that needs to take place. But I think it was just a little bit of our shift in mentality to kind of say, look, you have these different challenges, but because you're a nonprofit and you're really able to tap into people's hearts and souls, you actually probably could go out there and find an amazing fund developer, someone with incredible business development skills that if you were just a small for-profit business trying to make money for yourself, they might be like, I'm not interested. But as a nonprofit, it's like, hey, like this person really might want to make a difference too, right? Like think about it, like so many of us, we care about money, but we also care about making a difference. So it can be, you can look at it from a scarcity mindset, or you can look at it from abundance mindset and be like, hey, as a nonprofit, we kind of are able to tap into this talent pool of people, even if it's just as like a board of advisors or kind of an additional kind of unofficial capacity. There's a huge abundance of opportunities out there to support good causes.
Yeah, Brooke is in agreement with all of that. Recruitment and culture building within the board are really important to position the board to make the most valuable contribution they can, maximizing overlap of board bandwidth and skills with the greatest organizational needs. And I think that is really what you said there, Carolyn, because I've been in that scenario too. And I'm on 3 volunteer boards right now. So if you are listening to this and hope for me to join your board, I am tapped out, unfortunately. But there's also, as individuals, if we're really cognizant of like, okay, I'm on one board where I'm like very heavily involved in the marketing and managing some volunteer marketing coordinators. And there's one board where I'm the secretary and I come and take the minutes and that's it. So there is possible balancing there, but it also is really important, as Brooke stated there, to maximize the overlap of board bandwidth and skills with the greatest organizational needs. And I do think that this is something that, and I don't think it stated the age of the organization here, but especially if you are a young social enterprise, likely there's not a really good cadence yet on understanding what that balance is. And so that might be a really great takeaway, is just looking at maybe that like board matrix or needs of what we need from the organization. How does that overlap with the people? Because if we have a whole bunch of people who have a whole bunch of bandwidth, but don't have what we need that contributes to our needs, then it's nice that we can tell the CRA that we have board members, but it's not really doing what it could be doing for the organization.
There's so much power too in the donors that you have in your organization. They've bought into your mission in some way, shape, or form, right? So I volunteer with an organization as well, and we sent out an email yesterday saying we need some more board members, and here's the expertise that we need. We got 2 right away. just because we send out an email and ask, right? And sometimes people just aren't aware that there's a gap and they have something to contribute, and just tapping into that resource that you have already might just be your quickest, fastest recruitment. We also, to build on what Carolyn said a minute ago, we bring in some people onto committees. So if we're looking for expertise, we sometimes bring them in there. So they're not part of the board, but we still have them contributing to the organization. They get a chance to learn about us, what we do, and how they can contribute. And that becomes part of our funnel into board members, is having some of these people dip their toe in with us and work with us a little bit.
The awesome thing about that one too, Tim, is that, with a committee, you right away, like, you're identifying an area of focus, right? A committee likely gathers around a project. So the power of that, is really, really good. All of this is as a result of communication. And I don't know about you guys, but it feels like it's the hardest thing to do nowadays. And I know that seems trivial. I'm not talking about like walking by someone in the morning and saying good morning, or, saying thank you to someone holding the door. It's just like when there is that transition from a me to a we type of organization, the shift is all often massive. And when you're bringing individuals in and out that also operate in a profit sector, and then pop in, you're really bringing a different level of ways of working to the table, and likely individuals that are passionate about ways of working based on not just the way they work, but their other versions of we, right? So I think one thing, Carolyn, as you were speaking, that I thought was really powerful, and it made me even think about the visionary and integrator thing in EOS, is there is a requirement, or I wouldn't say, look, requirement's the wrong word, but this is a common practice, I will say, and normal, is that you have to have same page meetings. You have to get together with that partner, and likely that partner in this profit business is like, there's a lot of investment and things that have gone into that. But they get together and they like, what's going on, sometimes each month or each week. Yeah, usually it's a monthly thing. There's the topics of conversations, there's the big decisions, there's, like, we have to make sure when we walk into that boardroom, we're aligned. But one thing that was really powerful, Carolyn, and I'm not sure who was the catalyst to bring it up, but it took one person in that conversation with to check their ego and to ask for help to that group and say, like, I want to do more, but I can't. Like, I'm tapped out. And how many times have you guys been in conversation when you're completely overwhelmed and you're exhausted? And I feel like this is personal and professional blurred, like, all the time. You bring that up, and there's 5 more people that put their arms up that are feeling the same way. And they say, well, I had no idea you were feeling this way. Right. And then all of a sudden the conversation starts. And that's why I bring up communication, is we get caught in our own like world of what's important. I'm the only one that maybe feels this way. Like, what is someone going to think of me if I can't do this? This leader talked about ego. There might be other people out there or within these partnerships that are feeling the same. And like, willingness to be open and ask for help. I don't know about you guys, but like 100% of the time, it's had a positive outcome.
Yeah, and that really ties into what Brooke is sharing about his favorite quote about partnerships from Roger Martin. You are a vendor, not a partner, when your relationship does not make a meaningful difference to your partner's strategy. And I have never heard that quote before, Brooke, but I love that, because I tell people this all the time from a partner marketing point of view, is that this is not just about me sending stuff to my partners so they'll send it out. Like, it's not going to work. You have to build a relationship with your partner. You have to create something with the partner. So there's an investment on both sides. Feel own care for each other. Mm-hmm. Not like, you're doing this thing for me. It's not partnership. It's not successful from a employee point of view. It's not successful from a partner point of view. And I would say specifically not successful from a social enterprise point of view. And what came up for me, Lindsay, when you were sharing that was if the goal, because I mean, again, like there might be partnerships that exist already to some degree, right? There's probably some board members, there's probably some community organizations that they've partnered with for whether that's promotional or actually serving. But how do we support the partners? How are we thinking about people as partners? What does a partner deserve to get in terms of an exchange? And this also goes back to what Carolyn was talking about in terms of the capacity for that, right? Like the executive director can only manage so many relationships. If they're in the place in their growth where the executive director is still doing most of the service provision, the training, then we have to do that, right? Because that's what the grant fund is for us to deliver the training. But how can we create this robust partnership ecosystem? Also want to go back. The chat is exploding today. Thank you for contributing so many amazing things, everyone. Islam is sharing, when thinking about this problem, what occurs to me is that the community is either overwhelmed with not-for-profits or the value is not clear or not connected with the community's welfare directly, which is fine. They can think outside the box and actually serve the people that their cause resonates with, those who care, going back to Tim's point of who do you serve. A possible solution is to expand operations to relocate communities that their mission touches with the need of the community. So align the community needs with the goals of the organization, just to refocus the efforts. So also good points. And I think, and again, like these are the interesting things, right? Because it's not necessarily the easiest thing to just be like, well, we were focusing on Calgary, but Calgary's no good. So we're going to go to Edmonton or Saskatoon or Vancouver. There's a lot of stuff that comes along with that as well in terms of human recruitment and storytelling and alignment. And I would say from the storytelling and alignment perspective, there's a lot of people who need a lot of help in all of the areas. And so I would not necessarily default to this doesn't work here strategy, but it creates an opportunity to explore, okay, this isn't resonating. How are we tweaking that? How are we evolving that with the goal of finding that resonance?
Right, and I think that brings up a very important point, and I'll tell a bit of a personal story here about connection to something that's going on. I recently started an engagement downtown, and I haven't been downtown much in, we'll just say, a very long time. Let's just leave it at that. And I am much more aware of the homeless problem that we have and what that really looks like. And that's just from walking from my vehicle in a parking lot to the train to the office. And I just am much more aware. And being locked in the suburbia for many years, I didn't see it. And so as part of this funding dilemma is, are you going after people that really understand what's going on? Because when I was just in suburbia, didn't understand it. Once in a while, I'd see something, but it was very rare. But now I'm much more aware. And my Christmas donation this year went to a different place, one of the organizations that helps them, because I'm much more aware of what's going on. And so that's really a key part of I think what Islam is saying is creating that connection and awareness and going after the people that have that. Keith, go ahead.
Of course. One thing we haven't touched on that I think, there's a tendency right now to want to do everything right away. And you hear all these stories as well of people going from, zero to unicorn and zero to infinity right off the bat. And, I don't know how long this organization's been around for, but one thing we haven't talked about is also just patience and letting things have time to unfold and actually that narrative start to create itself. And, if this individual can look in the mirror and say, we have clarity, we have some of the right stakeholders on board, and we have some metrics and measurements that are going to allow us to know that we're at least pointed in the right direction. The reality as well is they're probably not going to become the not-for-profit that surpasses United Way in their first year. And I think that making sure that there's some measurements to allow for patience, so that they know they're pointing in the right direction, but also having some of that confidence and patience that they're headed in the right direction, I think is something we haven't really talked about too much here as well, that I think will be important for this person's sanity as they grow the organizations too.
I think that's a really good point, Keith, because I do think too, with a lot of organizations that are focused on grant funding, one of the things that becomes a primary deliverable for them is growth, right? Like how I serve double the amount of people I served this year than last year, right? Like, and it sounds good, but there's also organizational impacts of doing that. Actually, Lindsay and I were having a conversation about this just yesterday. Right? And it's similar from a for-profit point of view, right? When we say like, we want to double, right? We want to, oh, okay, yes, good. It seems like easy math, but why do we want to double? And would we want to double if that means that we can't execute XYZ? Would we want to double if that means we have to enter a new market? Would we want to do those things? And I mean, I think for every organization, regardless of whether or not you're a social enterprise, nonprofit, for-profit, like we want to grow, right? The goal is to grow, whether that's the financials or the impact. But at the end of the day, those two things are intricately connected to each other, and they are ramped up. Right? They don't just explode. And I think I think there's I've seen this a lot from a marketing point of view where everyone will just, we'll turn on more marketing and we'll double our sales in the next 12. No, you won't. It's not a thing. You can keep pretending it's a thing, except it's not. So let's talk about, one, why that number? Two, what is that even saying, right? Yeah, it indicates growth, but does a 10% also indicate growth? Yeah, it does. There's a lot of, when you mention unicorns, Keith, I think, again, a lot of times people start thinking about like, well, investors, right? Investors are looking for 10 times my revenue in 1 year. And you're like, are you going for investors? Because if you're not going for investors, it's completely irrelevant. But that those narratives start to impact what you're thinking and where you think you need to go and how fast. Brooke is sharing a comment on this point too. A lot of that we want to double comes down to our mindset and psychology. I want to feel successful, and these are the narratives that will show me to myself that I'm succeeding. This is a really important point because it mentioned ego and like kind of checking the ego in that. And it's still really easy to get caught up in the narrative, even if we're actively doing things that we think are helping us to check our ego.
And it actually goes back to value alignment, right? So if we heard from that leader that he wanted to check egos, that there was misalignment. And so it shouldn't be about growth. It should be about community creation. That's the success measure. So really anchoring back into what's important. What are you trying to build? What are you trying to create? And so the measure shouldn't be around growth.
Is so true. And like, I think it really does all come back to patience, right? Like, and that's where I get the drive, right? But it really is like that mindset around it. And I feel like you sometimes see those announcements, at least I see them on LinkedIn, where it's like the top 30 under 30, and there's like all this pressure to accomplish so many things. And what I actually find incredibly inspiring is like, you hear of someone that's 90 years old and goes back to school to do their PhD, or like, let's bring back like the top 80 under 80, right? Like you have an entire lifetime to make an impact. And sometimes we're in such a rush. And then when you're in such a rush, your time horizon shrinks everything down, and it creates this like overwhelm. But if you were looking at like, look, I really want to make a difference in this community, the community is going to be there for a long time, right? So if you shift your time horizon and shift your mindset, you're going to actually build the right foundation that like long term, you will be able to have those partnerships, you'll be able to have those donors. So I think we got to invent the like top 90 under 90 or top 100 under 100. Like let's extend the longevity view here.
I think this is a great point because also, and again, it's interesting when you look at these two things and you like take them back to logic, right? if I shorten my time horizon, in order to accomplish that, I probably have to shorten my accomplishment horizon. Right? So I can accomplish this amount in that amount of time, but I can only accomplish this amount in this amount of time. And it's so often, again, especially for young organizations, we're just looking at year over year, right? We're not looking at 5-year goals, 10-year goals, and how we're tracking against those things. So if we're only looking year over year, then we only give ourselves 12 months to accomplish things. But one of the things that's really interesting actually with a lot of tech startups is a lot of those guys build a 5-year horizon, right? I got to build software. I got to get like users for my MVP. I got to get feedback from my MVP. I got to redo my MVP. I got to create an enhanced one. Then I can maybe sell it to the market. And then I can maybe show investors that I can get some traction with this, right? And all of those things take time. And so not that we have to necessarily look at taking more time than necessary, but if we actually want to accomplish this thing, if we want to say the impact, we want to have impact on 1,000 people in a year, and we also know why we want it to be 1,000, right? It's not just because I pulled 1,000 out of the air. How do we build to that so that in 5 years from now, we can say we're serving that many people? But today we're only on day 1. So we're not going to serve 1,000 people tomorrow. We're going to ramp up to that. And with that, I want to just realize that we're getting close to the top of the hour. So we'll do a quick round table for any last minute, specific big takeaways that everyone would like to focus. So let's go around the room in clockwise direction. Vered, starting with you.
Yeah, I think just, again, we talk about it all the time, but really gaining some clarity, being really grounded in why you exist is always a good starting point. Making sure you have the right board structure with the right skills to drive your strategy forward is another takeaway. And outside of recruitment, which we didn't touch on, but I'm going to just add one little point, is thinking about how you're onboarding these partnerships and these new board members into your ecosystem and being really intentional about what the goal is.
I would say wrap it up with impact is your lead domino. You do really, really well. Knock it out on the park on domino. It'll make it so much easier to find donors and dollars.
I'm going to tie it back to what Tracy just talked about, and Vered touched on it too, is you started with a vision. You've learned some things along the way. Is that still the right vision? And don't check your ego at the door and just say, okay, we've learned some things. We've taken in some input. Are we still having clarity on the right mission and vision for the organization?
I think for me, I'd go back to the leader themselves, and they should be really proud of what they've done so far. They've taken an admirable step to do something good and not about themselves. And I think that the other piece is that time is an ingredient that they have to consider. And it's, you can't rush baking. Time is an ingredient in baking, just like time is an ingredient in the work they're doing. And so be easy on themselves, set realistic goals, and just continue to march forward, considering that they're not going to do it overnight.
I'm going to go back to what I started out with, just to circle back and recap, but just, with the statement of meaningful partnerships. Meaningful is a powerful way. Not profit is full of meaningful, right? So if you dig into that, and you start focusing on working towards a shared objective and willingness to have that conversation in a vulnerable way, with others, the other stakeholders in the conversation, that's how alignment happens. And that's how you get towards that shared goal. And that's how you get that sense of belonging, which will bring others in. You will become magnetic to others. So if you do your work, with the who, your who and your small group of who's, you don't have to scream all different directions. You will become magnetic to the right opportunities, the right volunteers, the right donors. It will come to you. You just have to be really, really willing to kind of dig into those meaningful conversations.
all the who's down in Whoville, Lindsay?
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Also, I'm just because we're wrapping it up, there are some more great comments from Brooke and Islam in the comments. So if you're watching, read those. I don't have time to read the rest of them, but they are good. Okay. I want to go back to what Keith said about how time is a factor in cooking and baking, right? So when you were saying that, Keith, what I'm thinking is that like I can't just crank up the temperature and get the same result because that higher temperature can cook it faster. It doesn't work. You end up with burnt scones. So let's not have burnt scones, everybody. Let's give things the time that they need and the focus that they need. And I think in so doing, we have a very great opportunity to create phenomenal social enterprises that are making huge amounts of impact. Oh, with that, my friends, this is the last gathering of the Fractional Forum before the holidays. So if you're missing us, you can go back and watch past episodes on our web. They are all on our website and on the YouTube channel, the Fractional Forum as well. We will be back the first full week of January, whatever the date, the 9th. I don't know, something like
The
that. The 8th?
The 8th.
Yeah, okay. The 8th. We'll be back on the 8th. And in the meantime, if you've been watching the show and you're like, you know what, I'd like those guys to do one of my business problems, head over to the website, fill in the form. We would love to talk about the business challenges that you are experiencing so you can kick your year off right. With that, thank you, panelists, for always having such a wonderful conversation. And until next year, everyone.